You've seen these movies 100 times. You know the lines, you know the faces, and you know the legends. But what if I told you that some of the most iconic performances in film history aren't actually what they seem? What if I told you that the star you're watching on screen, in some way, is actually a ghost? A placeholder for a performance that was secretly erased, silenced, or stolen behind closed doors. In Hollywood, the credits don't always tell the complete truth. The lead actor fired after 6 weeks of shooting, or the voice of a cinematic icon that was hidden for years to maintain the illusion. The history of the 70s, 80s, and 90s is peppered with stolen legacies. These are the actors who did the heavy lifting, built the character's soul, and designed the physical language of a hit in one way or another, only to be scrubbed from the final product when the studio decided they weren't the right fit. Today, we're opening the vault on 9 cinematic cold cases. These are the performances you love by the people you've never heard of. For decades, whenever you heard that mechanical, terrifying rasp,
I am your father,
you were hearing James Earl Jones. But when A New Hope premiered in 1977, Jones's name was nowhere to be found in the closing credits. The man inside the suit was British bodybuilder David Prowse. Prowse performed the entire role on set, pacing the corridors of the Death Star and delivering every line of dialogue with a heavy West Country accent.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away.
When George Lucas decided that Prowse's voice lacked the mythic quality he needed, he brought in James Earl Jones for post-production dubbing. The reason for the missing credit? It wasn't accidental nor malicious. Jones himself famously refused to be credited in the first film. He felt his contribution was merely a special effect, no different than the sound of the lightsaber or the hum of the TIE fighters. He was a professional actor who didn't want to detract from the performance Prowse had already built on camera. However, this special effect philosophy meant that for years, the man who gave Vader his soul didn't receive a dime in royalties or the public recognition he deserved. It wasn't until The Empire Strikes Back in 1980 that he finally agreed to take the credit, cementing a legacy that almost didn't exist in the eyes of the public. Picture Back to the Future as a gritty, dramatic thriller. That was the reality for 6 long weeks of production. Eric Stoltz, an actor known for his intense, brooding intensity, was the original Marty McFly. He spent nearly a month and a half filming the movie, and he played the role with a somber, serious tone that reflected his own acting style. But there was a massive problem. The movie obviously wasn't a thriller now, was it? It was a comedy. Director Robert Zemeckis and producer Steven Spielberg realized they had made a catastrophic error. Stoltz's performance was technically brilliant, but it sucked the air out of the room. It was too heavy. They needed the spark, the timing, and the light-hearted chaos that only Michael J. Fox could provide. In a ruthless business move, they fired Stoltz. Here's the kicker though. They didn't just recast him. They still used Stoltz as a template. Michael J. Fox stated later in interviews that when he finally arrived, he had to match the blocking, the movements, and the exact timing that Stoltz had already established over 6 weeks of hard labor. Stoltz was scrubbed from the film entirely. For years, the studio buried the footage, making it a Hollywood urban legend. By the time the world saw the iconic film we know today, Stoltz had been completely erased from the history of Hill Valley. A ghost actor whose hard work became the blueprint for someone else's massive payday. If you want to talk about true cinematic sacrifice, you have to talk about Mercedes McCambridge. When audiences walked out of theaters in 1973, white-knuckled and traumatized, they credited 14-year-old Linda Blair with giving the performance of a lifetime. But that wasn't Linda's voice shaking the theater. That was the soul-shattering, gravel-throated work of a forgotten legend. McCambridge, an Oscar-winning actress in her own right, went to hell and back to create the voice of the demon Pazuzu. To achieve that otherworldly, terrifying rasp, she put her body through an agonizing regimen. She chain-smoked, drank raw eggs, and, at the director's insistence, was tied to a chair in the recording booth to simulate the physical struggle of the demon trapped inside a child. She literally choked herself to get those guttural, inhuman sounds. But when the film hit the screen, the studio initially tried to hide her. They didn't want the audience to know the demon was a veteran Hollywood actress. They wanted everyone to believe it was just a child. McCambridge was initially omitted from the opening credits, sparking a massive industry scandal. She had to fight tooth and nail, even threatening to take the Screen Actors Guild to court just to get her name listed as the voice of the demon. She gave her health, her voice, and her dignity to make The Exorcist a horror icon, only for the studio to try and edit her right out of the history books. With Apocalypse Now, if you watch the movie today, you are watching a masterpiece of madness. But for weeks, the man leading that journey into the heart of darkness wasn't Martin Sheen, it was Harvey Keitel. Keitel was director Francis Ford Coppola's first choice for Captain Willard. He spent weeks in the Philippines, shooting the film's opening sequences and establishing the character's psychological descent. He was the Willard. But Coppola and Keitel famously clashed over the interpretation of the role. Coppola wanted Willard to be a passive observer, a witness to the insanity of the war, while Keitel played him with an active, aggressive intensity. Not only did Coppola just fire him, he went as far as to erase him. He secured the footage, brought in Martin Sheen, and reportedly told Sheen to look at the vibe Keitel had established, but to play it his way. For decades, Keitel's Willard was a rumor, a ghost story whispered on film sets. He was scrubbed from the final cut, his months of jungle fever and psychological immersion discarded like trash. He lost the lead in one of the most important movies ever made, and for a long time, the public didn't even know he had ever been there. When Tim Burton brought Batman to the screen in 1989, he didn't just make a superhero movie, he built an entire aesthetic of weird. But the blueprint for that weirdness wasn't just Burton's mind, it was a collaborative obsession with his inner circle, specifically Paul Rubens. Long before the world knew the Joker as Jack Nicholson, the creative energy of the film was being forged in a small group of artists who were pushing the boundaries of what a blockbuster could be. Rubens wasn't just Burton's friend, he was a silent, uncredited architect of the film's off-kilter vibe. He spent months on the periphery, influencing the tone, the physical comedy, and the strange, grotesque energy that defines Gotham. But because Rubens was the star of the biggest kids franchise in the country at the time, his influence on a dark, violent PG-13 superhero epic had to stay in the shadows. If the studio found out the Pee-wee guy was helping design the twisted, macabre soul of Batman, they would have panicked. He was the ghost in the machine, the uncredited creative consultant who gave the film its bizarre, unforgettable texture, only to be left off the masthead so the studio could market it as a serious cinematic event. He gave his vision to the Bat, and the studio made sure that vision was strictly off the record. When audiences first saw The Predator in 1987, they were terrified by a monster that felt like it had a cold, alien intelligence. I mean, as a kid, I remember running out the room whenever my dad watched the movie. We were told it was a masterpiece of animatronics and special effects, but the truth? The soul of The Predator wasn't CGI or animatronics, it was Kevin Peter Hall, a 7'2" actor who spent months in the suffocating heat of the Mexican jungle, trapped inside a suit that weighed nearly 50 pounds. Most people remember that Jean-Claude Van Damme was originally cast as the creature. He was fired after a few weeks because he hated the suit and didn't fit the imposing hunter vibe. But when Hall took over, he did more than wear the costume. He invented the character's movement. He studied the way a predator stalks its prey, creating the jerky, rhythmic, and deadly grace that made the creature feel alive. Yet for years, the studio marketed the movie as Arnold Schwarzenegger versus a special effect. Hall was rarely invited to press junkets, he wasn't the face on the poster, he was just the stuntman. He was the human engine behind a billion-dollar franchise, yet his name was almost entirely scrubbed from the promotional machine to maintain the illusion that the creature was real. He literally gave his life to the role. The harsh conditions and the heavy costume made the set a nightmare, only to be treated as a disposable piece of equipment by the very studio that made millions off his performance. If you grew up back in the day and hear the voice of Snow White, you'd know it instantly. But for decades, that voice was a prisoner of the most powerful studio in the world. Adriana Caselotti was only 18 when she was cast as the lead in Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. She was the blueprint for the Disney princess archetype, providing the vocals that made the film a global phenomenon. But once the film was released, Disney did something cold. They effectively blacklisted her. They didn't want the magic of the character to be ruined by the reality of a mere human woman. They wanted audiences to believe the character was the voice, not an actress portraying her. To protect that illusion, they forbid Caselotti from ever acting or singing on screen in any other capacity. They owned her voice, they owned her likeness, and they essentially forced her into career retirement. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s when a new generation of critics and historians began uncovering the hidden labor behind the animation that Caselotti finally spoke out. She spent the latter part of her life fighting for recognition and royalties, a battle she shouldn't have had to fight for a role that defined a century of film. She wasn't just a singer, she was literally a pioneer who was silenced by a corporation that treated her legacy like a trade secret. We've looked at the voices behind the mask, but what about the man who was the icon? From 1977 through the 80s, Peter Mayhew was Chewbacca. He didn't just stand there in a rug, he built the character's entire physical vocabulary. The way he tilted his head, the way he navigated the cockpit, the very body language of the galaxy's most loyal co-pilot. But behind the scenes, the treatment was jarring. Because he was hidden beneath 7 feet of yak hair and latex, the production treated him like a piece of furniture. While Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill were becoming the new faces of Hollywood, Mayhew was often sidelined as a stunt performer or a creature rather than an actor. For decades, the public barely knew his name. The studio focused on the special effects of the Wookiee costume, while Mayhew endured heat exhaustion and physical strain to maintain the character's humanity. It took until the late 90s and early 2000s, when the internet started giving fans access to the real people behind the legends, that the world finally realized the Wookiee wasn't a robot or a prop, it was a man. Peter Mayhew spent the prime of his life being an uncredited hero of the screen, essentially stolen by a studio that valued the brand of the Wookiee over the man inside the suit. It is one of the greatest what if in modern fantasy history. Before Viggo Mortensen became the Ranger of the North, there was Stuart Townsend. For 2 months in New Zealand, Townsend was Aragorn. He underwent the grueling sword training. He lived in the muddy, freezing conditions of the pre-production camp, and he developed the character's physical presence alongside the rest of the cast. But just 1 day before filming was scheduled to begin, director Peter Jackson made a brutal, last-minute call. He decided Townsend looked too young, too inexperienced to lead the Fellowship against the darkness of Mordor. Townsend was fired on the spot. This was the move that would define erasure. The studio didn't just replace him, they deleted his existence from the production entirely. When Viggo Mortensen was rushed in, he had to inherit the sword skills, the choreography, and the physical blocking that Townsend had already spent months perfecting. For years, Townsend's contribution was a whisper in the industry, an actor who had literally trained for the role of a lifetime, only to be cut from the final product's DNA. He lost out on the biggest blockbuster trilogy of the 21st century, and for a long time, the public had no idea that the Aragorn we saw on screen was actually stepping into the phantom shoes of a man who was erased practically hours before the camera started rolling. 9 stories, 9 performances. Whether it was the voice that gave a villain his soul, the actor who spent months in the jungle only to be cut from the final credit, or the ghost performances that became the backbone for a blockbuster, one thing is clear: Hollywood loves the legend. but it easily forgets the human. Some of these actors lost more than their credit or roles. They lost their place in the history of the films they helped create. So I have to ask, which of these lost legacies surprised you the most? How many of these entries did you know about beforehand? I'll admit, some of them surprised me while doing research for the video. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that like and tickle the algorithm. And if you learned something new, go ahead and sub for more. Till the next one.